Good evening. Hope you're all having a good evening, wherever you are. We're just about to start at 9 o'clock. Thank you for joining. It's 9 o'clock, so welcome to Bedtime Stories. Thank you to Alicia Pavaro for the invitation to read, and thank you to the Architecture Foundation for the fantastic 100-day studio initiative. I've learnt so much during lockdown as a result of the time that people have donated to allow this to happen. My name is Nick Walker, and I live and work in Glasgow. I'm an architect with our employee-owned practice, Collective Architecture, and also a studio design tutor in Stage 4 at the Mackintosh School of Architecture. I will be reading from Missing Margate by Michael Bracewell. The book was written in 1988 with a very florid prose style. It's essentially a critique of success, fame, and the emptiness that underpins the tail end of Thatcher's Britain. It is a mocking, critical look at excess and consumerism, style over content. I have picked two excerpts from the book this evening, and before I start with that, I'm going to describe what the story is about by using the back cover introduction. The hero of Michael Bracewell's mannered satirical novel is a disillusioned architect who has reached the pinnacle of trendy success only to find it unfulfilling. Max de Winter, who lives with his wife Rebecca at New Manderley, has created a new skyline for London with his innovative structures, Pac-Man software, Darblaze, Self and Assurance, the historic invoices library of the Museum of Corporate Finance, and the Church of God the Truth, Tower Hill. Utterly bored with his work and the hangers-on it attracts, including the vacuous staff of the avant-garde journal Designate, Max decides that bombing his buildings represents the only means of freeing himself from the stultifying ennui that plagues him. The hip, acclaimed builder transforms himself into an anonymous agent of destruction in a comic novel that recalls the work of Evelyn Waugh and Ronald Fairbanks. So the book is important to me because I was gifted it many years ago when I was studying management, living in Paris, and thinking, why didn't I study architecture? So I read the book, and it really pushed me into leaving management and recommencing studies as an architect, or to become an architect. It's quite interesting rereading the book after almost 30 years. It's certainly not the kind of architecture I'm interested in, and it's really quite different to the world we live in now. So there are quite a few sort of themes that I think are quite relevant to today. So with that in mind, I shall start reading the first chapter, excerpt, and if I've got enough time at the end, I'll read the introduction, which is a little bit the wrong way around, but you'll see why. I'm going to skip over a few words by accident as I go along because it is quite hard to read, so apologies in advance. The first sentence being one of them. 1. The hesitation of Empedocles. 1. No one knows your name. The bleached pavement rose up to Max de Winter's undefended eyes as he stumbled out of Duchess Street W1 and then stopped, wavering a little despite its solidity, because Max wasn't feeling well. On the freshly scrubbed facade of the BBC building that Max proceeded to lean, spitting and cursing against, red-faced and breathless, the slogan, "Nations shall speak peace unto nation," seemed, despite the authority of its sans-serif no-nonsense capitals, somehow inappropriate. The early afternoon sun made Max's eyes ache terribly, and he squinted nastily at a passing arts administrator before wiping some excess saliva from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. He had left his sunglasses on a bistro table in New Cavendish Street and was predicting their subsequent theft and destruction at the hands of the professionally rude waiter. His thought patterns were laced with a tearfully self-righteous suspicion and oath-laden outrage that frequently attached themselves to a self-pitying, physically uncertain, and hopelessly drunk young man. The sunglasses were important to Max, his only mast to advance behind, and life seemed unbearable without them. As he swayed like a tall building in the slipstream of Hurricane Ray-Ban, the glasses took on a totemistic significance, and their loss seemed to verify that in some underhand, insidious kind of way, his right to have any say at all in his destiny had been taken away from him. Max clasped the sides of his head and moaned quietly, his extravagant emotion giving rise to much twitching of net curtains in the windows of the office opposite across the street, which had been cunningly degentrified to make it look like an office. The traffic moved on across the lights, and Max crouched sobbing on the pavement, his hunched and defeated aspect being gradually obscured by a mist of russet exhaust. It was, one could say, operatic. It was also the day of the big launch, and the atmosphere around Fitzrovia, along Cleveland Street, along Goodge and Mortimer Streets, gusting behind the diuretic unit of Middlesex Hospital, sneaking down Tottenham Mews, and emerging with a self-conscious flourish, there, into the electronics retail end of Tottenham Court Road, had driven this section of West One quite rigid with indifference. It was the day of the big launch of Designate magazine, a new and exciting look at the future style of tomorrow, yesterday, or today, or next week, last year, possibly. The definition is irrelevant. The point of the thing is style, and Designate magazine had wide enough margins to make anything stylish. Max de Winter walked into one of the elegant pillars which support the soaring needle spire of All Souls, and was by that time past caring whether the future was here today or gone the day before. His past and his future no longer seemed to meet in his present, and the style of his confusion was of little interest to him. He wasn't there, not really. Max de Winter wasn't there either when Malcolm Houston, the new and exciting editor of Designate, was addressing his staff with the same mixture of generosity and wariness with which one addresses Christmas cards on the subject of young blood, old wood, and fresh pastures. This was at the big planning meeting. A room had been appointed with a view of the car park of the neighbouring television headquarters, and coffee was poured from a triangular stainless steel coffee pot with a parrot yellow handle and a spout the hue of July blue. As the coffee was drunk, ritualistically one might say, the clever triangular beakers were scattered with precision among dunes of forward profiling sheets, advertising copy, and provocatively opened diaries. Rough sketches were being made in moments of wild inspiration on the backs of proof sheets, and the illegible crudity of these illustrations remained in the centre of the table as evidence of their intention to attract favour from the editor, as opposed to demonstrate a point. Black fibre-tip pens were sucked and fiddled with, telephone numbers were seized with religious fervour out of the heated wardrobes of fame-hungry brains, and repeated litany-like by their captor until noted down as interesting. It was feeding time at the latest glossy. Malcolm was very frank about the cut of his jib, the tightness of his ship, and the passenger hostile persuasion that he expected of his crew. Heads nodded fervently at the mention of commitment, and watery smiles swam magically across tense faces when evening and weekend input was stressed. Knuckles crackled with the urge to impress, and not one knuckle crackled more urgently than those belonging to Arabella Cloth, the exciting new assistant editor, features, who sat on Malcolm's left. Sitting on Malcolm's left was a way of not looking at Malcolm, and thus subordination could coexist with individual flair by virtue of the lack of eye contact. Arabella looked hard at the tabletop and nodded when Malcolm outlined the market gap that Designate hoped to fill. She shook her head when Malcolm suggested, by way of proving himself open to criticism, that they might have made some errors in their brand profiling age group-wise. It was vital to commence both the venture and the planning meeting with a ritual of self-questioning. The admission of possible error, although not for one moment believed, served a vital role in establishing a backdrop of bogus maturity and clear-headedness against which the team could then act out their wildest schemes without fear of seeming any less than professional. An oriental dissidence filled the air when Malcolm said, "Are we ready to go for this one then? If we're not, we should say so." And it was at this point that Arabella shook her head. She shook her head without moving her lips or looking at anybody. She shook her headed ringlets and Soviet ceramic earrings by way of a token genuflection to ward off the evil spirits of marketing doubt and product insecurity, those gremlins within the periodical publishing machine. She was silently saying, as she shook her head, "No, Malcolm, we will not let you down. We are ready to go for this one." Arabella was itching to shine and knew that one moment's misplaced visible or vocal enthusiasm could eclipse her rising star with its cloud of unprofessional effervescence. Max de Winter was lying on his back in the Chelsea Physic Garden when Gemma Danvers, deputy editor in and out section and advertising, choked on a piece of chewing gum whilst trying to make herself heard during the debate on a projected feature entitled "New City Men, Who Are They?" Max de Winter was inhaling verbena by the stone lip of a fountain and thinking how, given just a little strength, he would simply press a button and disappear, whilst the designate team turned their media-sodden gaze to him and decided that he would make a splendid feature. Knowing his little army to march on sycophancy, as well as fear, Malcolm had shared a joke with the troops in order to win their support for this, his best, and only, idea for an in-depth designate style feature. You know when Bill Wilson over at Channel 8, the new late independent cable, told me about their profiling of Max de Winter Associates, I have to tell you, I thought he was crazy. And I'm telling you that. I thought he was crazy. And I said, Bill, you must be out of your mind. De Winter is just not fucking famous enough. Laughter. He's not even a potential revival. Hysterical laughter. The team are in stitches. Gemma used the general moment of shared hilarity as a cover for pouring herself another cup of coffee out of the terrifyingly awkward-to-lift coffee pot, which was just out of reach. Others lit cigarettes as they laughed. All these actions thus doubling as guarantees that the laughter was quite genuine and uncontrollable because it continued even as they did other things. It was there for a moment of regrouping and rearming, disguised as applause for Malcolm's anecdote. And now it must be said that Max de Winter and Max de Winter Associates were names to respect, for the very same Max de Winter who we discovered unwell at the junction of Duchess Street and Portland Place, and who subsequently had been observed inhaling soft scent in the Chelsea Physic Garden, is the most brilliant young architect in England. He who shaped the new London skyline, an aphorism that summed up the age in architectural language, and then underlined it with glorious style by marrying the beautiful Rebecca Walters, erstwhile child neurotic turned Cork Street fine art dealer par excellence, whose glamorous gallery is the international launchpad of the effortlessly uncommercial. Malcolm looked around the table for a minute and then continued. So then I got to thinking, and I'm telling you this now, then I got to thinking, well, it's a strange world, and maybe there's a story in this architect after all. He leaned forward slightly, a man just testing ideas, a man just running a few things up the flagpole to see if anyone salutes. De Winter is just turned 30. He's responsible for some of the most controversial office buildings in the city. London will never be the same again. But he's a bit of a mystery. So I think mystery, Howard Hughes, Gothic, meetings in car parks, sudden departures from restaurants, receiving the hands-on design awards in absentia. A place out of town. He's so public, yet so private, suggested Gemma hopefully. Possibly, Gemma, possibly. But I was thinking of was this. We do a feature on De Winter's buildings and stress the anonymity of their architect by implication. We stress the corporate structuring, what is it, angle. We do a late 70s Fritz Lang art school throwback, but new. I want the visuals to say desire, and I want them to say power. The romance of the post-bang career aesthetic interface when investment consultants have the kind of David Bowie photochromatic glasses glamour. I want to make Eurobond dealers screen dump finance projections in a way that would look good in designate. The De Winter buildings are a feature of the new city youth, pan-financial, slick, colourful, a little sinister. So what's the guy like? Who built them? What does he wear? How's his marriage? What's his aftershave? What's his opinion on religion? Does he eat out a lot? I'm putting you on this one, Arabella. Issue 5, the Designate Finance Supplement. That's an extract from chapter 1. And during the course of the book, Max embarks on destroying his own buildings. So later on in the book, he's at the last but one. Rebecca remembered the exploding sun that had been the birth of Max's stardom, the ceaseless attention and flattery. He can't put a foot wrong. Everything he does is art, legend. All for being good-looking and an architect, all for being a person, moreover, who used to be happy until the spotlight gave him sunstroke and changed into an inquisitor's blinding torch. London never tires of success stories, and why should it? Living as she had in the green room of triumph, Rebecca knew by heart the discourse of success and could follow the vapid annotations to glamour like a script. The circuitry of fame, the souvenir issue, the intellectually italicized portfolio that was rushed out by the backers at the merest sniff of serious money. In the absence of carefully marketed talent, and the industry that thrived within its hinterland, one could always consider the alternative option of the patronising classes, which is the profession of banking. A boy with whom Rebecca had hidden in the back of a wardrobe at a children's party for her 9th birthday was a commodity broker living in West Surrey. Perhaps that vivid incident of her prepubescent years had driven her to see only the madness of art pimping or the madness of money pimping as ways to a comfortable lifestyle. She was past caring anyhow, and wondered, with a quiet smile, which bank her crazed genius husband was likely to vandalise next. As Saturday dawned, Pac-Man software was wrapped in a deep, warm mist, and high above its lightning conductors, the golden sphere of the sun was destined to burn the sky into clear blue by mid-morning. Beside St. Paul's, a window slammed, and the pigeons on the cathedral steps scattered up into a wheeling crescent that soon dispersed into the masonry beneath the dome. It was going to be a very hot day. The air was thickening in the deserted streets, and by 9 a.m, the heat was enough to give the impression of a late afternoon. It was a day of permanent sunset, the eternal summer evening. A helicopter touched down on the landing barge opposite Bankside Power Station, the heat muffling the noise of its blades. The pilot, in short sleeves, was obscured by the dancing white lights that dazzled on the surface of the water. From the air, the city would have looked like desert canyons, the irregular slopes and plateau of golden and silver roofing breaking off into black chasms of shadow in the depths of which were the streets, the piazzas, the squares, and the alleys. The west facade of Pac-Man software was gently humming in the heat. The steel-caged air conditioning units that stretched at regular intervals beneath the 13th floor windows looked like basking lizards, and as Max de Winter stood beside a green security door and squinted up at the summit of his building, there was something malevolent about the presence of these wall-hanging fixtures. It was curious, he thought, that in order to win his personal war, he was forced to lose every battle. For Max, the loss of each building was a defeat. He had wanted his buildings to glorify the financial centre of the UK. He had wanted them to be architectural jewels in the crown of England, their design offsetting the virtues of a green and pleasant land, their aesthetic references intending to echo a proud historic legacy of English tradition. He had wanted to stay at New Manderley, his garden palace, safe in the knowledge that London carried on in his absence, growing prosperous and noble within the buildings that he had designed before his 32nd birthday. How pitifully naive. A sickness chilled him, and a dread of the work he had done and the role that it played in New England as the kinky dungeons of London-style city and the money brothel of Britain, where all the young executives smelt of stale fish and the sweat of progressive greed. Downstream, Angus was dreaming of a swimming pool beside the black sanded desert, only it was his old school again, and he was getting all the answers right by simply memorising the possible answers and underlining them in red. Carrying a heavy suitcase that contained a number of powerful small bombs that could be detonated individually or collectively by a thing like a TV control unit, Max let himself into Pac-Man software. The security men, 2 of them, had been informed the previous day that Max would be calling. Informed, that is, by Max himself pretending to be a personal assistant. Checking their appointment book, they respectfully tipped their hats, suspicious for merely the look of the thing. Security men must look suspicious at all times, yet are generally so bored that one can catch them out. Max felt sure that he was virtually invisible anyway, even as he stood in front of the wide reception desk and said, "I'm Max de Winter, the architect. You should have a note of my visit." He felt that he could neither be seen nor heard. "We thought you were one of those other lot," said the smaller guard by way of conversation. "You look like a fashion person." Max turned back, puzzled. What fashion people? But the guard was laughing, doubtless at the peculiar things that fashion people do, and so Max assumed that he was merely telling a security guard-style joke. First of all, Max went into the mezzanine cloakroom. In the lilac-scented air and purple lighting, he felt his head clear a little, and carefully planted one of his bombs, or leeches, as they are known in mafia circles, behind a roller towel unit. Pausing to wash his hands and water back his hair, he then pulled on some surgical gloves and made his way to the lift. Getting out at the 3rd floor, he planted 4 more leeches at either end of the corridor, 2 in the office of J.K. Cartwright, assistant director, exhibitions, and 2 more around the base of a cheese plant in the display department typing pool. On the 6th floor, he carefully unscrewed a panel off one of the cooling ducts. The sun was savage by now against the windows, and Max noted with pride the efficiency of the air conditioning. He was disorientated, however, by the mesmeric stripes of shadow that fell from the vertical fabric blinds, and looking down at his ankle-length cement-coloured raincoat, he felt like a zebra in a cage. Lighting a cigarette, he taped 2 leeches inside the service box of the cooling duct and screwed the panel back on. Feeling a little cavalier, he sauntered down to the large conference room that occupied the entire width of the east end of the 6th floor. On the large back wall hung a painting by Tom Vreeland, one of the lesser-known but highly collectible members of the London School. It depicted commerce in London, a twilight city scene of bus-tops and umbrellas against the buildings of London. In the foreground, a hunched-shouldered businessman stared accusingly out of the canvas and peered at Max from under the brim of his hat, round wire-framed glasses lending a trace of menace to his painted eyes. The painting was dated 1958, and its predominant collaging of grey and yellow was fragmented by snail trails of white that were the beginnings of a great British downpour. Max looked out of the window at the unnatural heat bouncing watery distortions off the rooftops of London, and then fastened a bomb to either side of the Vreeland's frame and shrugged. What the discovery of oil painting was to the Venetians, he whispered to himself through a cloud of cigarette smoke, let dynamite and remote control be to the art of Max de Winter. And I'm not really sorry about the Vreeland. 3 floors down, the designate team were setting up lights and breakfasting on fruit juice and tubs of Greek yogurt. Over by the window, the models were being carefully installed in the Myth winter collection. Catching 3 of her 27 bracelets in the wild foam of her newly acquired peroxide perm, Betty, the fashion editor, was having the compulsory professional crisis, her skewer-like personality making kebabs out of the sensitive natures of those she so enjoyed to supervise. Much moving and removing of people, lights, clothes and props later, the first 50 photographs were pronounced a mess. 3 tall girls with the standard issue white crew cuts had been photographed over and over, lolling moodily against door frames and marching with serious looks on their faces up and down the geometrical playground of the famous De Winter 4th floor corridor with its lime green pillars and triangular scarlet floor tiles. Dressed in short black denim skirts and stretched out jersey jackets, 3 more girls were beginning to pose themselves in arrangements of business surreality, as assistants various threw cashmere overcoats and account ledgers at them for nearly 2 hours. And then it was lunch, a short professional break for all the committed professional people, before taking to the roof to do the Margot Jones leather leggings and top coats. Soon the designated team were standing in the ruins of a salad that had been their lunch. Max de Winter, was working fast now, running floor to floor, depositing bombs in any and every available space, under desks, in waste paper baskets, between books, under sinks, and behind filing cabinets. Pac-Man software was alive with dynamite. Soon he was on the roof. Leaning against the low metal balustrade, he could see the whole of London bask beneath the afternoon sun. The river curled slowly into the heat haze, and the peaks of Centre Point, the Euston Tower, the London Hilton, and the funnels of Battersea Power Station were all clearly visible despite their one tone of powder-coloured gun-metal blue. Just down the street, Max could see the grued facade of the NatWest Tower, and behind him, sinking he felt into the warm asphalt, stood the complex steel knitting of the new Lloyd's building, pods a-quivering in the desolate heat, as though they were fruits ready to drop. The aluminium cladding of the solar panels could not be approached directly, so Max left his last 4 bombs on the cast-iron cradle that supported them. A hot wind buffeted off the roof structures, and Max had to steady himself with one hand as he closed his terrorist suitcase. Hearing giggles, whoops, and severely uttered little cries of warning of the approaching designate team, Max quietly slid behind a water tank and then took the service lift down to the ground floor. Nodding to the security guards as he signed himself out, Max casually strolled through the lobby and then went down to the street, suitcase empty, and raincoat flapping in a sudden gust from the pavement air vents. When to press the button? It didn't really matter. Or did it? Did he want to massacre the innocent fashion victims playing on the roof of his greatest building, dancing on his grave? Somehow he had not got the stomach for killing them knowingly. He sat in his car and left the prime detonator unit winking silently on the seat beside him. He felt tired, and the car was warm and airless. He dreamt. So to finish up, I'm just going to read the introduction, which is by, if I can find it, Brandon Taylor from the book After Postmodernism. And then I will finish. Introduction. As one New York analyst wrote recently apropos this new frenzied consumer consciousness, there is now a new type of patient who is presenting himself. The classical neurotic for whom psychoanalysis was invented suffered from symptoms which were lodged in a self that was otherwise intact. By contrast, the new patient of the postmodern period has not even progressed to the point where a stable identity structure has coalesced. Typically, he or she suffers from feelings of emptiness, isolation, and futility, pre-Oedipal rage, and primitive separation, which are masked by grandiose narcissistic fantasies, fueled by the marked intensification of the pursuit of material success, power, and status, an increased preoccupation with youth, health, and glamour, accompanied by difficulty in forming relationships with emotional depth. Excessive alienated narcissism, frequently masked by social adaptability, has come to dominate our era, according to this perception, just as hysteria and later neurosis did Freud's. So as we are in this time of COVID, and we think about the world that we left behind, a world that was becoming increasingly divided between rich and poor, between those who have and those who have not, that was really focused on image and stardom and fame, it's worth taking that time to think back how many of these themes are still relevant to the world we left behind. And hopefully, when we come out of our COVID-19 existence, we can think about these things and change the world for better. Thank you for listening, and have a good evening.